It's always awkward when you're asked to talk about immunisation in Aboriginal people when you know that not only are there many people much more qualified than you to talk about it, but many of them are actually sitting in the room that you're about to address. So I don't claim to be an expert. I also take the opportunity to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. I also recognise the particular importance of the Torrens, which is just behind us, as a meeting place for the Kaurna people before it was colonised almost 200 years ago. And 200 years ago there would have been many hundreds of Kaurna people in this area, but I note that in the 20 years after South Australia was colonised, they were almost completely wiped out when the colonisers accidentally contaminated the river behind us with typhoid. Those of you who are from South Australia will know exactly what this is. This is the proclamation of South Australia as a province in 1836. And you'll note that there are a few of the ancestors of the Kaurna people depicted in the background, but not many. And the reality is, even before the colonisers came to this part, there weren't very many Kaurna people left. Probably part of the reason for that is that if you're South Australia, you know that this occurred on December the 28th, and it was officially stinking hot on that day, just as it is today. And many of the Kaurna people would have done the smart thing and retreated into the foothills where it was considerably cooler, rather than standing like Captain Hindmarsh here in his full kit in 40-degree heat. But there's also a much more sinister part of the story, which is described here by George Augustus Robinson. It was the epidemic of which the natives of South Australia speak, he wrote. They say it came down the Murray from the country far to the east. And this is the epidemic that they were speaking of. This is smallpox. And as Jack said, this is absolutely dreadful disease and makes Ebola look like a mere inconvenience by its very high attack rate and its high fatality rate, especially in completely naive populations like the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were at the time. There have been a lot of debates about where this came from. Predictably, the British blamed the French. More recently, Australian scholars, perhaps as a sign of the times, decided to blame the Indonesians instead, with the suggestion that it was the Macassan traders from modern Sulawesi who brought the disease down through their trade routes into the north of Australia. But there's very little doubt about where it came from, because it wasn't here before the Europeans came. And we know that because it's extremely and graphically described in the chronicles of those who came here in the First Fleet. These are two German Lutheran missionaries who were in South Australia in the very early days of the colony. And they wrote a dictionary of the language, and they made note of Nuya, a word meaning a pustule, the disease of smallpox they universally assert that came from the east or the Murray tribes. About a decennium ago, it was universal when it diminished their numbers considerably, and on many left the marks of its ravages to be seen at this day. They have no remedy against it except the Nuya Palti, or the smallpox song, which they learnt from the eastern tribes. This is Captains Hunter and Collins surveying the damage in the Sydney Harbour area. They've come across an Aboriginal woman who's been abandoned. And their description is graphic. It was truly shocking to go round the coves of this harbour, John Hunter said, which were formerly so much frequented by the natives, where in the caves of the rocks which used to shelter whole families in bad weather, were now to be seen men, women and children lying dead. And perhaps even more moving, this description given to us by Colonel Collins of the reaction of Arabanu, who was the first Australian man held captive by the colonisers, on our taking him down to the harbour to look for his former companions. Those who witnessed his expression and agony can never forget either. He looked around him in the different coves we visited. Not a vestige on the sand was to be found of the human foot. The excavations in the rocks were filled with the putrid bodies of those who had fallen victim to this disorder. Not a living person was anywhere to be met with. He lifted up his hands and eyes in silent agony for some time. At last he exclaimed, "All dead," hung his head in mournful silence, which he preserved during the remainder of our excursion. The motivation for this remarkable man, Jack mentioned, Frank Fenner, who grew up here, who went to school just downstream from here, Thebarton Boys Tech, and did one of the most remarkable things that has ever been achieved in public health. Helped to eradicate, played a major part in the eradication of smallpox through his direction of the United Nations World Health Program in the 1970s. Thanks to him, Aboriginal people don't suffer from smallpox. Non-Aboriginal people don't suffer from smallpox. And hopefully no one ever again will suffer from smallpox because of vaccination. As Jack said, he managed to achieve what we haven't been able to achieve for any other infectious disease. He managed to completely eradicate it. You can imagine the huge effort required. Just think of the efforts being put into Ebola virus at the moment with very little success. And this man, just 30 years ago, managed to do what we can't do today with Ebola. Next, hopefully on the list, will be polio virus. We're hoping. If you can eradicate it, then you can close the gap and you can close it forever. If you can't eradicate it, the hope is to eliminate it. And we've had some great success here through vaccination. Measles, rubella, almost mumps, essentially eliminated. We do get small outbreaks of measles, obviously, but it's virtually eliminated. Meningococcal C, terrible disease, another terrible disease, and Haemophilus influenzae B, virtually eliminated even before I finished my medical training, thanks to vaccination. I'm going to show some slides, and I have to give acknowledgement to this publication, which is a couple of years old now, which is a collection of slides and data put together by Rob Menzies and colleagues at the National Centre for Immunisation Research. So these graphs are theirs unless I say otherwise. Haemophilus influenzae type B. This is what happened after the vaccine was introduced. Almost completely eliminated, except in Aboriginal children. Certainly a reduction in the incidence, but clearly not yet eliminated. Meningococcal C disease, almost eliminated in non-Indigenous children and adults, still a small amount of disease in Aboriginal children. Meningococcal B disease in Aboriginal people is still a major problem. If we can't eliminate, then the best we can hope for is to mitigate. And this covers most of the vaccine preventable diseases that we still tackle today. Rotavirus has been a particular interest of mine because of the substantial discrepancy in the burden of disease suffered by Aboriginal children. After the introduction of the vaccine in 2006, 2007, you can see there's been a reduction over time. In fact, just because of the scale of this, you can't see the much more significant reduction that's been seen in non-Aboriginal children. Fantastic vaccine, but clearly still a large burden of disease suffered by Aboriginal children across Australia. Pneumococcal disease, invasive pneumococcal disease, again showing what a fantastic program the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine program has been for young children who have been vaccinated. A substantial reduction in invasive disease after the introduction of the program. But for for Aboriginal children, a reduction, but still a significant burden of disease remains for invasive pneumococcal disease. For the grown-ups, for the adults older than 50 years, again the scale makes it hard to see, but for non-Aboriginal elderly, or people over 50 I should say, a significant reduction over time. In fact, a large part of the total benefit of vaccination of children has been achieved in the elderly. For Aboriginal elderly, in fact, the incidence of disease has increased over time, or appears to have increased over time. A disease for which we don't actually have a good vaccine. And in fact, we have the impression that we're losing control of whooping cough over time, and we'll have a talk about this specifically later today. You can see for non-Aboriginal children a significant increase at the end between 2008 and 2011 across Australia. The burden that much greater for Aboriginal children for whooping cough with current vaccines. So why is there the persisting gap? Firstly, and probably most importantly, failure to vaccinate and poor timeliness. This shows the difference in vaccine coverage and vaccine timeliness between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children. This is vaccination with measles, mumps and rubella at 12 months, showing that it's increased over time for non-Aboriginal children. For Aboriginal children, an increase, but you can see, starting from a low base, only half of Aboriginal children receiving their MMR dose within 1 month of it when it's due, increasing steadily over time, but still a significant gap that needs to be closed. And look at those children who don't even receive it within 6 months of when it's due. Still an important problem. Vaccine's not going to work if it doesn't get into arms. Crowding and high transmission. These result in a younger average age of infection and greater coverage needed to achieve the herd immunity that Jack spoke of. I'll illustrate this for rotavirus, but it's true for a great range of infectious diseases. You see so this is incidence of rotavirus by age, showing the significant discrepancy for Aboriginal children, in this case in the Northern Territory, with non-Aboriginal children, with a huge incidence occurring right from birth, a very early onset. It makes it very difficult for vaccines to work if the vaccines are only given at 2 months and 4 months, when a large part of the burden of disease is actually in the first few months of life. Probably less important, I think, but still true, at least for some vaccines, is a weaker immune response, resulting in primary vaccine failures and also faster waning. Again, some data on rotavirus infection and rotavirus vaccine effectiveness in Aboriginal children, showing the reduction in the effectiveness of the vaccine as you get older, so that their protective effect has almost completely worn off in the 3rd year of life, and is certainly greatly diminished in the 2nd year of life. But good effectiveness in the 1st year of life. Finally, more vaccine serotype mismatch. So vaccines not necessarily targeting the types of infection that are seen in Aboriginal children. Again, illustrated with rotavirus vaccine, excellent vaccine protection against serotypes that are closely related to the vaccine, but for the other vaccine serotypes which are common in Aboriginal children, a fast waning of their protection, so that any protective effect is greatly diminished and almost gone by the 2nd year of life. So where to? What can we do about failure to vaccinate and poor timeliness? It's obvious. We have to concentrate on efforts to further improve coverage and timeliness. Crowding and high transmission. Our vaccines will work best if we improve the quality of housing, not having as many people crammed into a 2 or 3 bedroom house, and improve the health hardware in those houses, making sure that water can be boiled, making sure that the hot water can be put in a tub to bathe the child, making sure that the toilets work when you flush them. We can have to think about trying to deliver vaccination earlier. And this is where considering vaccination in pregnancy is important across the population, but especially important for Aboriginal children because of the high burden of disease right from the moment of birth. Weaker immune responses for some vaccines, that's easy, we need better vaccines. But we could also consider using the vaccines we've got at higher titers, or perhaps more realistically, just providing additional doses. And that's the approach we're interested in looking at for rotavirus vaccine. The vaccine serotype mismatch, vaccines that better target the serotypes that we see in Aboriginal children, or vaccines which are more robust to diversity in serotypes, either multivalent vaccines or vaccines that target antigens that are more conserved across strains. Finally, some good news. This is hepatitis A and the impact of a targeted hepatitis A vaccine program for Aboriginal children. If you're an Aboriginal child born today, you've actually got lower risk of developing hepatitis A than if you're a non-Aboriginal child. I challenge you to think of a single other infectious disease for which that's true. And it's only possible because an effective hepatitis A vaccine, an effective targeted vaccine program for hepatitis A for Aboriginal children. So we can do it. We can do it. I just want to finish with Frank Fenner's own recollections of the World Health Assembly when he announced the eradication of smallpox. As I said, one of the most momentous occasions in history and certainly in public health. And it speaks to his humility and his modesty. He's clearly a man of action and not a man for flowery and impressive speeches and words. These were his recollections. There were hosts of photographers, TV crews and the like. The President of the Assembly spoke first to introduce me. I then spoke as Chairman of the Global Commission. Then the President of the Executive Board presented Resolution 1, accepting the global eradication of smallpox. The President of the Assembly then asked, "Are there any objections?" After waiting for 30 seconds, he banged his hammer and signed the new assembly parchment, followed by the Director General. Representatives of the 6 regions of the WHO then spoke, and finally the Director General gave another short speech. The Global Commission parchment and resolution were placed on display in a glass case. The Director General then hosted a reception, after which I went back to my hotel and had a good sleep. If you've achieved what Frank achieved, you can deserve to rest. And with his level of modesty and humility, you can't help but wonder if he rests with an understanding of the full impact of what he did. I hope he did. He passed away a couple of years ago. For the rest of us, sleep has to wait until after the job is done. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
As a nutritionist, I'm often interested whether nutrition plays a role in optimising vaccination response, and wonder whether that's actually a strategy that can also be used.
I'll start by saying that nutrition is extremely important, and important for Aboriginal children in particular. Having said that, people have looked very hard to find an association between nutrition and immune responses, and except for in very severe malnutrition, it's been hard to show a clear response. We've been very interested in this for rotavirus vaccine because rotavirus vaccine is one of those vaccines which is less immunogenic in disadvantaged populations, and there's been a lot of conjecture about exactly why that is, and it's probably, like all of these things, multifactorial. Aboriginal children in the Northern Territory are almost all exclusively breastfed in the first months of life, and in fact the nutritional status of most Aboriginal children in the first few months of life who are being breastfed is actually very good. So I don't think the vaccine failure that we see is likely directly related to nutrition. We are interested in how the gut flora affects immune responses, and there's a lot of interest in this area, and that may well hold a key, and it may well be that establishing a healthy flora from early in life actually improves vaccine responses.
So Tom, can you tell me a little bit about your ideas about how we can improve timeliness, particularly for Aboriginal children?
I think, again, there's going to be more than one answer. What's known in the Northern Territory from work that Ross Andrews and others have done, just documenting clinic presentations for remote Aboriginal children, showing that the average Aboriginal child living remotely in the Northern Territory will access the clinic dozens of times in the first year of life, and yet won't have received 3 vaccine doses by the time they're 12 months old. Missed opportunities for vaccination is a significant player, and it's understandable. These children are presenting sick. They have ear infections, skin infections, throat infections, diarrhoea. That's why they're coming to clinic, and people are holding off giving the vaccines because they have the idea that you can't give a vaccine to a child who is ill. The problem is these children are never well enough to receive a vaccine. The message has to be made more clear that in fact you can and you should vaccinate a child even if they're not perfectly well, because the consequences of missing that opportunity can be very high. So that's certainly part of it. For urban children, again, it's very complicated, but getting urban Aboriginal children linked into service delivery is a problem. And in Perth, we know that there's often a delay even having children registered, Aboriginal children registered on Medicare. They are often in the care of auntie, grandmother. And these things all play a role in delaying vaccination for Aboriginal children. So the service we have to provide has to recognise that. And one program that is about to start in Western Australia will actually use infant nurses who will identify Aboriginal children as they're born and will help to link those infants into services, routine infant care, development screening, but also importantly immunisation services. And I don't think it's intensive, it's expensive, but I think that's probably what it will take.
Tom, I work as a practice nurse, and one of the problems I come against is that Aboriginal children that we have identified, when I do talk to them about immunisation, they tell me that we're not out with the mob, we're not out in the country, we don't need to immunise.
That's an interesting observation. The data suggests that objection to immunisation by Aboriginal people in Australia is very low, and in fact Aboriginal people are much less likely to object to immunisation than non-Aboriginal parents. So acceptance of immunisation overall is high. Rates of refusal are low. Overall coverage is good. I think the main issue is with timeliness, and that's borne out by statistics. And that's a matter of developing the services, the infrastructure to have children immunised in a timely way.